NFT universe and community seems to move so quickly. I don't know that it's giving artists enough time to actually sit with the work, think about it, develop it, right? I mean, it's almost like they've finished one project and they're already on to the next. You know, it's taken me typically in a single exhibition, a physical exhibition, I might show 10 to 15 pieces, and that exhibition might take me a year to produce. Well, it's taken me a year to produce 10 of these, NFT works. And in some ways, I've thought about it in a similar way to the way that I produce art in the physical world. And artists need time to also, make mistakes.
Matt, Ale, what's good?
Doing great.
Doing amazing, bro. Thanks for having us. Who do we have on today, bro?
We have Daniel Arsham. Daniel Arsham is an incredibly accomplished contemporary artist. His creativity has never had limits or been bound to one medium. He's helped design and do the architecture and installations in Kith stores around the world, which is one of the kind of leading fashion boutiques and footwear boutiques. He's done iconic sculptures. The creative director of the Cavs recently designed Gunna, the chart-topping rapper's album cover, right? So I think he's always been operating at the intersection of culture and art and pushing it forward. So it's no surprise that he's been doing amazing things with NFTs. I think in today's conversation, we do a deep dive around some of his projects and an upcoming project that'll actually be going live on April 30th. But I think it was really fascinating just getting his perspective as this very accomplished contemporary artist who's always moved the needle, getting his perspective on how NFTs are changing the art world, how they are providing a new creative canvas for artists, and what inspires him the most. So what stood out to you guys? Start with Matt.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you kind of nailed it. Like, there was a lot of excitement in the NFT space when Daniel Arsham entered because, someone of his caliber, someone of his stature. And I think he also did justice to the medium, his whole eroding and reforming sculptures. Like that is a great example of something that just would not have been possible to do and to release in this way and to have a collector base for prior to NFTs. So I think he gets it. And I think he understands that this is an additive thing, and it was really cool to hear him kind of detail how he's embraced the medium and his thoughts about the metaverse as well. How about you, Ale?
Man, I'm a huge fan of Daniel Arsham. Actually, my first traditional art piece was one of his sculptures that I actually picked up after I saved enough money working in the restaurant industry. So similar to you, Matt, like when I heard that he was coming on to NFTs, it was like a no-brainer for me. Lindsay and I lined up and we picked up one of his pieces. But like, what really excited me is like his completely different and quite refreshing approach to NFTs. Right? Like he's an artist that's not necessarily playing what the field is doing. He's playing his own game, right? He's more intentional spending time with his art. Like his drops are not necessarily one after the other. He's actually being incredibly intentional around it and also finalizing things, right? Like something that was really for me was like, hey, this is 10 and done, right? Not like, hey, 10 and maybe later, right? Like actually closing a chapter on something is very powerful in an age that just welcomes iterations, right? And that's something that's really refreshing. And personally, man, I just love his fashion, dude. Like I just love his swag all together. Like just the way he dresses, all his shoes behind his interview was really dope. And being Florida native, I always got to support the people who come from Florida. So that's really all about it.
I love it. I love it. Well, we have tons of fun stuff to dive into in today's conversation with Daniel. If you haven't already, do encourage you to check out the last part of this set of Eroding and Reforming Sculptures. You can do that by looking up his socials, Daniel Arsham. Also want to encourage you, if you haven't already, we actually a couple months ago had the opportunity to go and do a studio tour of Daniel Arsham's studio in New York City. You can check that out on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/NFT now for the Behind the Drop episode we did with Daniel. But without any further ado, let's jump into this week's episode, Mr. Daniel Arsham. Daniel, what's happening, man? Welcome to the show.
Thank you guys so much. So happy to be here with you.
Yeah, man, super excited. So you've been kind of innovating within art for a while. So for starters, very curious what kind of sent you down the NFT rabbit hole. How'd you enter the space? What intrigued you early on?
Yeah, during pandemic, it was a time for me to revisit a lot of previous ideas in my own work. And just before COVID, I actually had a long discussion with the Winklevoss brothers about Nifty Gateway, and this was kind of before I would say the vast majority of people in my circle knew anything about NFTs really. And it took me a while to really understand the potential in it, and specifically this idea around a programmable artwork, right? The sense that through the smart contract, you could create something that could alter itself over time. And I really started to see these avenues that were creating potential for artworks that I wasn't able to create before this new technology. And so that was really the sort of the drive, right, for me to create the first NFT, which I released about a year ago now, which completely leverages the smart contract to create an artwork that actually erodes and reforms over the course of a year.
That's really awesome. Let's dive a little bit into that aspect because, like, when you dropped that, I think that was a almost like one of the first artists to actually incorporate a technology of this sort. Can you tell us a little bit about the Eroding and Reforming Sculptures NFT series?
Yeah, so I've created physical works for the last decade or so that sort of reimagine objects, some from our present and some from our historical past, as if they have been reformed in crystal, let's say 10,000 years from now. And obviously, when I make these works, I I want them to look as if they're in a state of decay or erosion, but I don't want them to continue doing that, right? They're in a sort of frozen state. And so the potential for using the smart contract to basically allow the work to change over time was something that felt so new and um, I don't know, like an advancement, right, of ideas that I had already had. So effectively, I created a work that is a sculpture. It exists within a space that has views out onto a garden, and we catch a couple different views of it. And each time that you go back to this work, depending on the time of the year, the work will have changed, right? Pieces of it may have further eroded. In one case, during the height of winter, it actually falls off, collapses onto the floor. And the seasonality is also changing outside. So when I released the work, it was spring, the birds were chirping outside, there was flowers. And if you look at it now, it's winter and it's snowing inside of this universe. The work will be sort of reborn, right, in April, well, later this month when spring really comes into the fold. And it will continue on this cycle of erosion and reformation forever.
That's a fantastic way to explain it, and I love that attention to detail, incorporating marrying kind of IRL and URL on that front. So that's really awesome. It's one of my favorites. And I have full disclosure, I am an owner of one of them. So I'm a huge, I just want to make sure everybody knows on that front.
Yes.
But this is a digital sculpture to close. You're about to drop the digital sculpture that's going to close out the 10 NFTs you announced back with the drop on Nifty Gateway. How does it feel to, two questions. How does it feel to come full circle on this project? And how do you plan to reward your top collectors who were able to collect all 10?
Yeah. I mean, when I started, I began with that first one in mind, and it took me, I mean, 6, 8 months just to build that first one. And I think many people, when they think about, oh, what is an NFT or what is the artwork component behind that, in many ways, for me, the development of these works is as or more complex than creating a work physically, right? Creating an exhibition. And so the second batch that I created was all based on these eroding and reforming cars that are kind of moving through these landscapes. They change their states of erosion based on the length of these races. And the final four that I'm working on sort of combine different aspects of my work, different interests, right? So I am releasing four unique editions. Each of them is a car that is traversing a different landscape. We have a 68 Mustang that's driving through a city. It's raining in the city, and there are massive sculptures that are placed within the context of the city. So it's sort of leveraging a potential scale that I've never worked in, right? I have sculptures in these NFT editions that are 100 feet tall, right? Which may be impossible to make in the physical world. And I've got an E30 that's driving on the surface of the moon, a DeLorean on Mars, and a 61 GT California that's driving through a jungle landscape. And in each of them, there's a combination of an eroding vehicle and these larger scale sculptures, all unique. None of the sculptures are repeated. And just dialing in the way that the cars move and the feeling of the erosion and the landscapes. I know I sent you guys like a teaser of all four of them together just to get a sense of that, but definitely the most complex, certainly NFT that I've ever created, but potentially the most complex work, right, that I've created. And I think when so many people who come to me to discuss NFTs, they're interested in the utility aspect of it. Like, what can this actually do? And I know, Matt, you have this great quote that's, if you're not here to bring value, then basically leave, right? There's no point of it. And I see the biggest thing for me that's so interesting about NFTs is actually like, it's basically like a community builder, right? You have these collectors, you're able to create benefits for them. And I think I can, discuss a couple of things that I'm announcing here. One of which is that I've been slowly trying to understand how I could create, basically, I don't want to call it a whitelist, but a community of people who have one of my NFTs in their wallet that I can give them access to events and pre-releases for physical editions, books that I'm coming out with, signed copies of things like that. And the way to do that is through a Discord server that I'm going to be unveiling hopefully over the next month. I just want to make sure that it's done correctly because we've seen some other artists have some difficulties in forming these things. And so there will be that aspect where in the future, people who own one of the NFTs will have first access to physical sculptural editions that I'm releasing. And for collectors who manage to get all 10, right? So the edition numbers have been reducing as I've been releasing the editions, and there will only be 50 potential complete sets of the 10. And I don't think we've sort of looked at the metrics. I don't think that there will actually be 50 people because of the way it's distributed. But for those who collect all 10 of the NFTs, we're going to do a screenshot in a couple months, and whoever has those 10, I'm going to be airdropping an 11th in there, which is a totally unique work. Whatever the number is that's minted on that day, that's how many there will be, right? I think it will probably settle somewhere around 15 to 20 people is what we're kind of estimating. But that should increase, participation, right, in the community around them. And the 11th one, I'm not going to reveal it yet, but it's a very special scenario. It includes all of them in it, right?
Love that. Love that. No, and I think it's important, just like we touched on the idea, like the distinction between like creating value and then like extracting value, right? Like we want, like you got to come to the space proper in terms of like really wanting to build and create that value, and then then sharing it versus like taking stuff out of the space. So I think it's a great example of that.
Exactly. And that kind of thing hasn't really existed for artists before, right? Like if you think about
Yeah.
like companies have used like, I guess you could call it like a loyalty program or something like that, where people are they've participated. This is like a way for me to not only build community, but also allow people who have been there for the ride to access things that are not available to everyone.
Totally. And I think we got some great questions on community building and the NFT space. But before we jump into those, just kind of like dialing in a bit on like your artistic approach and aesthetic, like, erosion is like a frequent theme in your work, and especially within the
Mm.
context of like technology and like, things that like they are kind of like what we almost expect to see from like past relics being applied to like, to contemporary pieces of technology or even future technology. And I'm curious as to hear like what's the deeper meaning there for you, and how do you how do you kind of channel that in your work?
Yeah. So I've always been interested in archaeology and time travel and, I don't know, space. And I've tried to integrate some of those interests into my work. And one of the interesting things as an artist to think about something like archaeology, right, where we look at an object from the past, and if we go to a museum, we are told a story about this object. Who were the people that made it? What was their civilization like? How they actually produced this thing and what it meant to the culture in which it existed. Inherently, there's some fiction in that story, right? Like there's no way to definitively know how these things were done and what the era felt like in that moment. So we accept a lot of these things to be completely true. Um, but I started to think about the idea that I could potentially create a sort of fictional archaeology of the future, right? Like, what are the objects from today which are going to be a relic in 1,000 years, and what will they look like? And so the physical transformation of, say, a camera or a basketball from its original materiality into a material like crystal or volcanic ash, we have the sense that there has been this geological time that has transpired in the making of this work, right? It's not a camera that's painted to look old, right? It has a sort of truth quality about it in its physical property. And I think that lends a lot to our understanding of the work, right? As an artist, I want my work to be able to speak visually, but also in concept. And I think that the material of the work, in some ways, can tell us as much about the idea as what it looks like, knowing that it's crystal. And the other sort of compelling aspect of that material for me is this idea that when we look at these pieces, they look like they're in a state of decay, right? They look like they're falling apart. But we associate crystal with growth. We think about crystallization, right? Snowflakes forming and these things moving over time. And so the works have this potential where they could either be falling apart or sort of growing together to some sort of completion. And in that way, it's like we're sliding a bar, right, on this time scale. We can move backward in time and we can move forward in time conceptually, right, in our minds. And I tried to bring some of that sense of play with time into the work that I've done in the NFT space. Um, in addition to I've done a couple of editions. I also made one unique work, which is owned by a collector, Pablo Rodriguez Fraile. And that piece is a sculpture which actually will erode over 72 years, which is the average human lifespan. It will basically be completely collapsed after that. And I think Pablo and I, neither one of us will probably be alive when the termination of this piece happens, but the following day it will be reborn in 2094. And this is like a magical potential to be able to do something like that that literally didn't exist, 10 years ago before the advent of this technology. And I think we're just scratching the surface of what you can do with that, right? With the idea around the smart contract. I mean, I've leveraged the idea of time within it, but there's so many other possibilities that I think other artists may employ.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. And I mean, it's been fascinating to see how that intentionality and these deeper meanings have manifested within the NFTs and being able to be very progressive as it pertains to not just copying and pasting an existing version of one of your works into a 3D model, but instead really trying to have it evolve and adapt over time. So I'm curious in that same vein too, like how do you feel NFTs and the technology itself builds and changes the creative canvas for artists?
So I think we've seen a lot of amazing artists that are native to the space who really understand what it can do, how community can be leveraged within it, And then I think some other artists, have sort of taken, as you said, pre-existing works and tried to like port them over to this, which for me, I may like them as artists. I find those to be less interesting. And the other big aspect of it, which in some ways is much more transparent than the art world, right? The physical art world, is this idea around value and capital and how capital is deployed and how we chart value over time, right? When I think about, my work from the beginning of my career, if you bought a drawing of mine my first exhibition in 2004, you would have had like 1,000,000% gain in value to now, right? And I think there's no way to like look at that and chart that online, but with NFTs, you can actually really understand how people are collecting, sort of like what else they're collecting, right? Being able to look into people's wallets and see like this collector has all of these things. It just presents like a very unique kind of new scenario for understanding um, where people's minds are at in terms of collecting.
Love that. Love that. On the topic of collecting too, I think like one of the things that's really exciting about NFTs is that they kind of changed the relationship between artists and collectors. Previously in the traditional art world, a lot of times there'd be galleries, there'd be other intermediaries in the way, and it would be kind of difficult for collectors and artists to necessarily like build that direct personal bond. And I know that it's if anything, it's almost the opposite in the NFT space, and artists and collectors are really kind of going hand in hand. In fact, artists are also becoming collectors and the like too. So there's kind of like a lot of like really interesting interplay there. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Like, how do NFTs kind of transform that relationship, and how is that kind of manifested in your own experience?
I mean, that is absolutely a new sort of universe for artists. My own career, I started exhibiting with a gallery in Paris, Emmanuel Peretzin, who I've been very fortunate. He's an amazing gallerist. He's supported me from the very beginning. That's not always the case, with certain artists. And I've been fortunate to be able to have that kind of relationship. That's, my work going to the gallery and Emmanuel and his team sort of pushing that out to their network of collectors. But I've also, for almost a decade now, had my own sort of editions uh, company, right, entity that releases editions of my own work, which allows me a direct connection with people who are collectors of mine. And we've toyed with the idea in the past of how do we create like a group of people who would potentially, we would make sure that they had access to certain works, and there was no real like metric or system for doing that. And so, as I mentioned before, we're exploring now, by through a Discord server, being able to actually link that with people's wallets. I'm also looking at other ways of creating, in the future, potential links between an NFT and a physical work, where the NFT would actually serve as like a certificate in a way, uh, for authenticity of the physical work in the physical world, but that would still allow those owners to participate in any community-driven initiatives that where they would need access, right, through the ownership of the NFT. Um, I think for a lot of younger artists, this new idea of connecting directly with collectors and clients can be amazing. I do think there's a bit of a danger in it as well, because things seem to move so quickly in this universe. And I we've seen this said before, but I do think that there are a lot of projects out there that will not hold value over time. I mean, maybe in a year or 2 years, but I always look at my work as, I want it to retain, you know, um, importance and value, over 100 years, or past my own lifetime. And I don't yet know or completely understand how some of these projects may hold that value over time. There are certain ones that have gained, when they're relevant within culture outside of that, and they're being pushed to larger communities. They have utility outside of that, which could be a really interesting potential in the future. I mean, we saw what happened with um, just the ownership of the IP around CryptoPunks, I thought was such an amazing uh, kind of like surprised that it actually happened in that way. But an amazing gift that they were able to give to owners of them, because those things are going to represent, entities in this new digital frontier, and to not own that IP is a bit strange. So we'll see where all that goes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic that you bring up. And so, from your perspective, like, what are some of the metrics or some of the tall tale signs that a project will succeed, right? Like you mentioned CryptoPunks with IP, things of that nature. But going into it, what are some things that you look for or that you'd like to incorporate into your own projects, or externally, what do you look for in other projects?
So I tend to be quite conservative in terms of what I'm looking at, and I'm mostly looking at things that I know that are a tried and true. I don't want to say commodity, but I understand the arc of that artist's career. So I think what Takashi has done in digital space, both with CloneX and this new project, which unfortunately he's had trouble getting it off the ground because of all of the sort of scams around it, which is unfortunately a very difficult thing that's happening now in the space. And I think that there needs to be some community driven initiatives to basically kind of attack those people who are doing that, because they're sort of ruining the ability for a lot of creators to enter the market in like a real way. But that's a whole other topic. So I'm looking at, artists that have had work out in the world for quite a while. I think Damien Hirst's project is pretty interesting. Um, Even though Pac is native to, this digital space, I think that the conceptual framework around the practice that Pac has developed feels very familiar to me when I look back at art historical precedents for that. These minimal artists from the 1960s and 70s, who were creating works that similarly investigated simplicity, right? The idea that the pixel is it's just simple but sort of genius idea, and I could see an artist from a previous era, making something similar. And then there are certainly projects like CryptoPunks. I think uh, if I was between those two PFP projects, right, probably the most well known ones, Bored Apes and CryptoPunks, I think CryptoPunks have, first of all, they were the first, but there's something very I don't know, iconic, right? That I think looking back at those literally in 25 years, it's going to be looking at like a Warhol. It's immediately recognizable. There's a utility and a simplicity to it. The project was the first of its kind. I think those are going to hold value over a very long period. And I think, frankly, will be quite important in the story of art history when it's written in 20 years of this era.
That's a really great take. And speaking of like traditional artists and bringing the conversation to the IRL world, um, you're the creative director for the Cavaliers. And that's a very it was announced, I was like, whoa, okay, out of left field. That's really that's like a really
Hmm.
refreshing take for a team to actually bring forward like a traditional artist to actually lead the creative direction on that front. From that perspective, any future plans to incorporate NFTs into the team?
So we've looked at it. I think that, it will happen eventually. I certainly the NBA, and I'm sure that every other, sports related franchise and team is looking at it. I think it's going to be a lot slower process to understand, because it's really about creating a roadmap. As we said before, it's like you all of this nonsense around like rug pulls and like just pulling value out of that. It's not really what we're interested in. And I think it's bad for the community in general. So I think for the team, we want to find out, are there interesting things that we can do, for instance, around um, using NFTs as the tickets, right, for entering either events or games. Can there be, potentially things that are given out to only people that were at certain games? There's all kinds of like participation, um, like an added value that we can give to understand our team, our city, and the focus around that. It's quite new, I think, still though for that.
Yeah. Love it, and it'll be interesting. And I think in that same vein too. I mean, you as an artist have always been operating very well at the intersection between kind of culture and art. So I mean, I think Cavaliers, interesting example, designing this architecture, a lot of the Kith stores around the world. More recently, the Drip Season 4 Gunna album cover. It's been amazing to see how you're really leaning into kind of contemporary culture and injecting your own artistic perspective. So I'm curious, how long do you think it'll take for more kind of like pop and contemporary culture to really lean into NFTs in the coming years?
I think right now, the idea of Web3 and NFTs in general, it's first of all, it's so new, right? The technology is only a couple years old. I think it needs to transition from being this kind of buzzword that companies feel like they should be involved in it because of it's so present, to them actually understanding what it is, frankly, and what the utility can be around it. Because it's really just another system for transacting in goods, right? And creating unique items. Certainly, artists and entities are familiar with how to create value in the physical world. And I think once they go from understanding that NFT doesn't mean money, right? What it means is actually community and kind of the ability to create unique things and finding utility in that is when I see it being a much wider sort of application and use potential.
Yeah, for sure. I think very much at this kind of early adopter phase where general users are, even just kind of the user experience itself too presents a lot of friction for like the mainstream user, even though as a creator, I'm sure as you're going through the process of minting.
Yeah, part of it is also the amount of people that really understand, first of all, understand NFTs, but even understand crypto in general is infinitely small. And that needs to become, I think once at some point governments will be, issuing their own cryptocurrencies. Once this becomes like a very regularized thing that feels like very everyday, I think the idea of ownership of these other digital assets beyond, right now, I think the use cases for NFTs have been largely in, let's call it something visual, right? Something that exists as a video or an image, or some sort of physical thing, but exists visually primarily. Once that starts to enter the music, we've seen a couple of smaller things with that, but you know, I am involved in a company called CXIP, and I brought Pharrell in to sit on the board of that company, and like his thoughts around like the potential for NFTs to upset the music industry, just like listening to him speak about that, it's crazy what it can actually do to create value, not for the companies, but for the artists themselves. And we're just starting to scratch the surface of that.
Yeah, for sure. No, very excited to see how that plays out. And also too on the Gunna artwork side, curious how that came together. I know one thing that's been interesting in the NFT landscape too is how in music specifically, how a lot of people that historically were very much just kind of commissioned and really like sat behind a veil when it came to commissioning album artwork or commissioning stage visuals. I think this was an interesting example of like musicians, a notable high profile musician, really treating the art surrounding their music as a true collaboration. So I'm curious how that came together and what advice you have for other artists that are looking to kind of lean into contemporary collaborations with people in other artistic realms.
Yeah, so I've worked with other friends in music before, with Pharrell, with The Weeknd, um, and Gunna reached out. I guess it was about 6 months ago, and sort of just said like, "Hey, I'm looking for some interesting ideas around the album that I'm coming out with." It was sort of unclear about when it was going to be and like which exact tracks were going to be on it. So um, I he was certainly familiar with my work, and we discussed a number of different options. What I was looking for, and I think what is most important now when thinking about an album cover for an artist like him, is that it is literally something that when it's this small and you're looking at it, in Spotify, or that it's immediately recognizable and iconic. And I think, the image that we created with the glasses, like, I mean, the amount of different potential covers that I went through with him was like crazy. And we just stare at them and think like, is this going to be the one? And sometimes you just have a sense about it, looking at it for long enough that this is going to be something really special. And yeah, I mean, it's amazing to do that. I've done a couple of other album covers, but this is the first like number one album. So yeah, it's been amazing.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Obviously, a big, big cultural moment there with that album and its impact, and really great to see that. One thing that many people may not be aware is the fact that you're actually colorblind, and I'm curious to hear a little bit about how that has influenced your art.
Mm. So, when you're a kid, you go to the eye doctor, you do the colorblindness test. So that was kind of a realization, I guess around 5 or 6. I didn't really think about it again until I was in college. And there's a course that you take. Most students who study at a college, at least in the US, in the first year, you'll take a color theory course. And, the professor asked, is there anyone colorblind? And I sort of was like, yeah, I guess. And he was like, well, you basically get a pass for this class because you're not going to be able to see half of the things that we're actually doing. And the idea around color theory is really that when you view color by itself, it can be influenced by having another color next to it, right? The way that your eye processes color is dependent on the context around it. And so I'm not able to see a large portion of that. It doesn't mean that I don't see color at all. It's just that in certain spectrums, I see a vastly reduced variation in color. And I think that one of the potential benefits for that is I've tried in my work to work with colors that I know that I see well. So, or that I see similarly to other people, right? So white has been a very prominent color in my palette. I've often worked with the surface of the gallery walls, kind of manipulating them, causing them to erode, to stretch like a sheet. And this reduction in palette, I think, has sort of made the work very identifiable in a certain respect. Um, it's like I wouldn't say it's necessarily a handicap. It's like it's a difference, right? And it's led to this potential where I have some choices that are made for me, right? Sometimes having less options is an easier route.
Yeah, man. I think the reduction of options that opens up the what does Einstein say? Like genius is like it's actually constraints.
Simplicity or something. Yeah.
Yeah, it's genius is working with constraints at work. Yeah, that's what it is. But
Mm.
on that point, like, what would you have done differently had NFTs been around during your come up?
Oof. I don't know. It's hard to know. I think that as I talked before, a little bit of the danger that I see is because the uh, NFT universe and community seems to move so quickly. I don't know that it's giving artists enough time to actually sit with the work, think about it, develop it, right? I mean, it's almost like they've finished one project and they're already on to the next. It's taken me typically in a single exhibition, a physical exhibition, I might show 10 to 15 pieces, and that exhibition might take me a year to produce. Well, it's taken me a year to produce 10 of these, NFT works. And in some ways, I've thought about it in a similar way to the way that I produce art in the physical world. And artists need time to also, make mistakes. We, in the production of the NFTs, there was a couple that just didn't work. I couldn't get the landscape to work properly. The visuals didn't feel like they settled or they were real, and I had to abandon them. And I don't know that many artists in the space are giving themselves time to do that. So I hope, as things progress, things will settle, the dust will settle. Um, Artists who I think have given the proper amount of time and attention both to their work and their community will still be around.
Yeah, absolutely love that. And I think you've alluded to a couple different things throughout the course of this conversation, but I'm curious, what really inspires you most about the potential of NFTs now they can impact creators and their communities?
For me, the largest interest, as I said, is around this idea of leveraging smart contract to affect things over time. And I've toyed with some other ideas about things that actually potentially also change based on influences, right? We've seen all of these projects where the ownership of one type of medium, when combined, things can change. So I haven't quite determined, where I'll go after this, but I have started to think about both community and the ability for people to actually influence the visual of the work, right? Typically, when I create a work in the physical world, once the piece is done, that's it. It's not going to change over time. Um, this could this technology could create potential for these works to be infinitely malleable. They could change in material, they could change in scale. So all of those things I think are just amazing as an artist. For me, it's in every medium that I work, there needs to be like a reason for going into that. If I'm working in painting, I wanted to do a certain thing versus sculpture. And it's the same in this NFT space. It needs to be there for a reason. And I think between the idea of community and the potential within smart contracts, both of those things are highly engaging for me.
Yeah, makes total sense. And like just looking at like your 3D work that you've done, as NFTs, like it's all like very lush, very detailed, very like oriented. And I remember looking into like watching the clip that you mentioned and immediately feeling like this could be taken straight from like a virtual world. And so I am curious to hear your thoughts about how are you thinking about the metaverse with regard to your own artistry?
The same slow pace that I that I feel like I entered the NFT space, I think I'm really trying to understand, where I might impact things in metaverse, or which metaverse, where would I place things. I don't think we quite know, right, really what that's going to be. There needs to be sort of one unified space, right, planet, universe that we all might be able to play in order for these things to, I think, to have like permanence and utility and hold value. And I don't quite know for me that it's there yet. One of the things that I am super interested in, Pablo, who's a collector of mine and a friend, just the idea about architecture in the metaverse, that it doesn't need to obey things that are present in the physical world, I think is like so amazing. Like he has all these museums that, he's built, and some of them there's like trees growing upside down. And it's just the ability to do something like that. That could be something that I think would draw me into creating something in metaverse space
That's really exciting.
architecture. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting, especially with the looks and everything. Like I love like suspending disbelief and gravity and engineering and all that stuff out the window. You can just like beautifully
Exactly.
create that. Super excited about that. Speaking about like things that are catching your eye in that perspective, who are some rising artists in the space that have caught your eye or who you're keeping track of?
Yeah, I mean, in digital space, as I mentioned before, POC, which I think is also this interesting idea around anonymity, right? Nobody knows who POC is. Is it he or she or them or a group, or we're not really sure. I think that creates the potential of intrigue, and as an artist, we are often tasked with kind of sharing a lot of ourselves, right, out in the world. It's very, at least as a young artist, can be very uncomfortable in the beginning to reveal these parts of things that feel very personal in a way. And I think the idea of anonymity is pretty pretty interesting within the space. Certainly, I've been looking at what Fuocious did last couple of days, and the works prior to that. Friends with You is I think some incredible artists. I happen to know them personally, and I've known them for years, and I think it's been great to see the way that they've integrated in a very sort of seamless way this digital environment into their own works. And yeah, we'll see where it goes.
Love it, love it. Well, I guess as we start shifting towards a close, I know kind of we've been speaking throughout this conversation about different inspiring use cases, our outlook on adoption over time. I'm sure as you've been more vocal and starting to release your own NFTs, There have been some people that have come out of the woodworks that just think NFTs are an outright scam, or even as you're engaging with some of these bigger brands and evaluating and looking into potential NFT activations, like what do you have to say to people that do think NFTs are a scam?
Unfortunately, to a large degree, in some cases, I do think that that's a problem. It has been a problem, and I think that the community itself needs to regulate it more and needs to really be on people who they believe may be doing these things, because it's kind of ruining it for a lot of the rest of us who are very much engaged in that. Surprisingly, with my own work, I never really had that criticism, and I think part of it is the just the amount of like effort that went into the creation of that. I think people can immediately understand like, oh, this is something that really couldn't exist before. Like every time that the piece has changed states, right? The first one, it's like kind of it's a very magical experience to have something that you own and to come back to it, the following day, and like the leaves have changed color like in this digital environment. So that's one reason why I think we haven't really seen that criticism on my work. But also, frankly, like the value retention in them. I mean, they had all of them are well above, their original price, and the volume in trading has been very heavy. So I think, people can say, oh, maybe this is a new medium. But if you look historically at the value in my work, as I said before, if you bought something 15 years ago, you would have had like a million% increase in value in it. So value, I think it's important only in maintaining, um, you know, people want to feel that the things that they're investing in are going to be important and valuable in the future. And so I think as artists, we also need to contribute as much as we can to the works and their future value as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Well, look, as we bring things to a close, I know that we mentioned earlier about some of these upcoming projects you have. What do you have coming up that you can speak to currently? I know there's probably some stuff in the works you can't yet.
Yeah, so the next release, which will complete the 10, is happening on April 30th, Nifty Gateway. So this will be the final 4 in the 10. Collectors who manage to have all 10 of those in their wallets at a future date, which will likely be sometime in the summer. I'm going to be airdropping an 11th into their wallets. The 11th one is a pretty special. Basically, as soon as I've completed it, we'll be able to release it. It's probably the most difficult thing that I've ever tried to make. And as I said before, I haven't determined anything specifically, but I am starting to think about architecture in the metaverse and play around with potential within that. What would a space that I design look like in the metaverse, and how could that aid in the experience either of NFTs that I've created, or frankly, like physical work that has been ported into the metaverse. And then, of course, I have some large scale IRL exhibitions coming up, probably the largest of which is at Yorkshire Sculpture Park in the UK in the fall. Also have an exhibition at a museum in Marseille in the south of France opening this summer. The museum is called Mamo, and it's on the roof of a very famous Corbusier building, which is a kind of mid-century, really incredible mid-century building. So super excited about that. And, a couple more games in the season. Hopefully the Cavs will make the playoffs. It's very close. We'll see.
Let's get it, man. Well, super grateful to have had you on the show today. Keep up all the incredible work, man. We'll catch you in the metaverse.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you guys.
All right, cheers. Man, that was an incredible episode. Love what he's doing. As a car fan myself, too. I know Ale and I are both big F1 fans. Fun to see how he's really how he's evolving and iterating upon his own favorite pastime of cars. He has quite the crazy IRL collection. So to see how he's bringing them to life with his own spin in this virtual context is really, really fascinating. What stood out to you guys in this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, look, like, he's just a force. He's a force in the world of culture, and seeing that crossover into the NFT space and getting his perspective on where we're at, in terms of bringing new people in, the adoption side, the way that this empowers artists, also the pitfalls of how fast the space moves. I was really glad he spoke to that. This I always say this space moves so fast, weeks or months or years. Sometimes that's not enough time to sit with your art. There's a lot of pressure on artists to release, and there's a lot of pressure on artists from all these different sides. And I actually thought he spoke really well to that. That's an area that artists, in the traditional world haven't had to deal with in the same way. So refreshing perspective there. Great chatting with him, and excited to see what he continues to do. How about you, LA?
Matt, you bring an excellent point. I think that addresses something that I think is very prevalent, but very few people are not talking about. But NFT fatigue can be very real, right? From an artist perspective, from a collector perspective, right? Like from a collector perspective, if I'm seeing an artist consistently drop art, that's not really a healthy situation, I love that refreshing take. For me, what really stood out for me was his conversation around bringing community regulation around scams, right? Like really making sure that was really touched upon, because it's such an important role, right? We are an incredibly self-regulated marketplace. There's been a lot of rugs that have been happening to the community, and we need better tools that are going to be around for us to really protect and not only the purists in the space, but the tourists, right? Like there's so many people who are entering the space through some of these quote unquote NFT drops that end up getting rugged, and immediately that changes their whole perspective of the NFT space if that's your entry point. So I love that. And then just really like the final point of how he is really just rewarding his collectors really stood out for me. And I'm just really interested and very intrigued to figure out how that's going to really evolve, because he's always so intentional, right? And he's not just talking about the run-of-the-mill, hey, here's an airdrop, or here's an event. So I'm excited to see everything that he may do, because imagine like if you get a private tour of his next showcase with him, like FaceTime with the artist, that's just really, really awesome. And his stature is going to create a lot of trend setting. So I'm excited for that.
1000%. I think it's people like Daniel Arsham have a big domino effect into mainstream culture. I think it's very exciting to see him continue to prosper in this world. So thank you all for tuning in. Another week, another podcast in the books. We'll be back next week. Until then, we out.